This is Books of Titans, the podcast dedicated to the influences of influencers. The books that have helped shape prominent inventors, business leaders, athletes, intellectuals, scientists, and others. We'll talk about what makes these books such classics, and at least attempt to have an intelligent discussion about what makes them so important and influential.
Hello, this is Erik Rostad coming to you right outside of Nashville, Tennessee. Today I'm going to cover Killing Commendatore by Haruki Murakami. This is book 24 of 52 for my 2019 reading list. This episode will consist of 3 segments. The first will be a brief introduction to the book, the author, why I read it, and my initial reaction. Second segment, I'll cover some ideas that stuck out to me and still have me thinking, and I'll also cover a criticism I have of the book. And the final segment, segment 3, is the one thing, my one key takeaway from this book. So on to segment 1. The author is Haruki Murakami. He was born in 1949 in Kyoto, Japan. He is an only child. His father was the son of a Buddhist priest, and his father was involved in World War II and was deeply traumatized by that war. Murakami himself was heavily influenced by Western culture, both novels and music, and that comes through in his writing. Some Japanese authors don't consider him a true Japanese author because he has been so heavily influenced by Western culture. But perhaps that's why he is so beloved around the world. His books have been translated into a number of languages. His first job was at a record store, and he also ran a jazz bar. And I'm sharing a lot of these things because they should stand out as you should see some connections to characters in Killing Commendatore and parts of Murakami's life that bleed into this work. Murakami is also a runner, and he has also translated a number of books into Japanese. So, for instance, works by F. Scott Fitzgerald, he's translated some of those into Japanese. In April 2015, he was named one of Time 100's most influential people. And I want to share one quote that's always bugged me about Murakami. And it's a quote I see a lot of people put up on Twitter, and it goes like this: if you only read the books that everyone else is reading, you can only think what everyone else is thinking. End quote. I hate that quote. I hate it. I don't believe it at all, and I always wonder, what was Murakami thinking saying that? If you only read the books that everyone else is reading, you can only think what everyone else is thinking. I talk to people all the time that read the same books that I do, and we get vastly different things out of those books. But when I looked up this quote to see where it actually came from, it's not like Murakami was talking about in general about reading and making this statement for people that read books that a lot of other people have read. This comes from a quote, so it's coming from a character in his book. And yes, it may hit on a philosophy that Murakami has, but it's a character in a book, and when it's within context, it's not as striking as how people usually present it. And I was thinking about it. It's like, what if Mickey Mouse said something in a cartoon? Would you say Walt Disney said this, even though it was Mickey Mouse who said it? You wouldn't. And so I think you got to be careful with quotes taken out of a book, because that doesn't mean Murakami believes it. And it's kind of, in a way, taking it out of context when it's not something that Murakami just said, but rather is something a character said. So I'm glad I cleared that up in my own head, because it's something that's bothered me. But I'll link in the show notes to the entire segment, and it's in an excerpt from his book Norwegian Wood. So a little tangent there, but let's get back to the storyline of Killing Commendatore here. The book itself is written in first-person narrative, and it's considered to be historical fiction, although that seemed a bit of a stretch for me. One of the other books on the list this year was The Widow of the South, and that takes place in Franklin, Tennessee. There's actual people who lived, and it takes place at a plantation that you can still go to. And so to me, that's historical fiction, because it's taking a lot of pieces that were there and then creating a story around that, kind of embellishing what you know and kind of filling in the gaps. Whereas this didn't feel like that to me. Yeah, it referenced some historical events, but it wasn't that deeply embedded. I mean, it's more like modern day happenings, but they go back in time at some points and talk about World War II and different events, but not necessarily that it was historical fiction in that sense. So that seemed weird that it's labeled as that. But anyway, into the story here, we've got an unnamed protagonist. And by unnamed, I mean there are 681 pages in this book, and we never learn the main character's name, which is interesting and is something I've been thinking about. Why is he not ever named? Everyone else in the story is named. But anyway, the unnamed protagonist, he is fresh from a divorce, or a divorce that's kind of in the works. And to get away, he does a little trip and then winds up at a friend of his father's house. The father's just gone into a nursing home, and so the friend allows him to stay in this house, the protagonist to stay in the house. The father was a famous painter, and so when the main character goes into this house, there's a studio set up, and there's also the records of this painter, the audio records, so operas, classical music, that sort of thing. So he discovers an unknown painting by this artist, who's Tomohiko is his name. And the painting is called Killing Commendatore, which is where we get the title of the book. But this depicts a scene from the opera Don Giovanni by Mozart. And it's actually the opening scene of that opera. And so Killing Commendatore is a painting that takes that scene but puts it into a Japanese style painting. And over time, this painting comes to life. Some of the people in the painting, I guess, kind of come out of the painting, and you can talk to them. The main character can see them and talk to them. And they're 2 foot tall people, but he can talk to them. And it goes further where he goes into this underworld and comes out the other side. He goes through this ordeal, and he enters the painting in a way, and that's kind of part of the underworld. He's got to do what happens in the painting to enter this underworld. So the protagonist is a painter himself, so he goes into the studio and he paints a lot, but he does find this painting, the Killing Commendatore painting, in the attic. It's hidden away. And that's what gets this whole story going. I don't want to give away too much because I don't want to give any spoilers, and so just kind of a brief overview of what the story is and the name where we get Killing Commendatore. I read today, so after reading the book, that this is a loving homage to The Great Gatsby. Now, I have not read The Great Gatsby for many years. I read it in high school, and when I read in high school, I didn't like reading because it was forced. And so I don't remember a lot of what happened in The Great Gatsby, and I haven't even seen the latest movie, so I can't even really think to storyline in how it would line up with this, but I think it would be neat to read the two books side by side, one before the other, and then see why this is an homage to The Great Gatsby. The structure of the book, it's broken up into 2 parts. The first part is called The Idea Made Visible. And so it kind of, the painting, the Killing Commendatore, the ideas in that painting becoming visible, becoming actual people. And then the shifting metaphor is part 2. As for who suggested the book, I suggested this one to myself. This is usually a part where I tell where I first heard about the book. But it was more, I was introduced to Murakami through a friend of mine who I'd seen. She posted on Instagram that she had read 1Q84. And this was probably 5-10 years ago. And that was the first time I'd ever heard Murakami's name. And she was just raving about this book, saying that she just loved it. And so kind of got me interested in Murakami. And so last year I read one of his nonfiction works, which was what I talk about when I talk about running. So I'm a runner. I saw Murakami was a runner and thought this would be a good introduction to him. And I'm glad I started out with that book, because not only does he talk about running, and that got me fired up, but he also talks a lot about his writing style and also music. So it was neat. You get a little picture into Murakami's life. And so I read a nonfiction work of his, even though he's best known for his fiction work. So this year was my first fiction work, and this is my first fiction work by him, the Killing Commendatore. So that's how I was introduced to Murakami, and then I decided, I saw this book in my favorite bookstore here in Franklin, Tennessee, Landmark, and I picked it up and then added it to my list this year. I read it between June 23rd and July 2nd of this year, so I'm recording this July 3rd, 2019, so I just finished it late last night. It took me 9 days to read. It's a 681-page book, so that's roughly 76 pages per day, which is on the high end for me. I need to maintain about a 47 pages per day clip to get through all my books this year. So when it's above that, that means I'm enjoying the book and I am making my way through it rather quickly. It took a total of 17 hours, 39 minutes, and 22 seconds. Yes, I track this stuff. I enjoy seeing how long books take. And I do that also so that you get kind of an estimate on what the amount of time it would take you. I'm not a fast reader. I don't speed read or anything. So 17 hours, 39 minutes, and 22 seconds may seem like a lot, but the average American watches 4.5 hours of TV a day. So that's only 4 hours of TV time for the average American. So you could, if you're doing that right now, 4.5 hours of TV, and you stopped doing that and picked up this book, you would get through it in 4 days. So just, it's not a lot when you put it in those terms. As for my initial reaction, this was like the perfect book for me. I love music. I love art. And for those things to be referenced throughout the book was really cool. There's opera references. Obviously, the Killing Commendatore is a scene from Don Giovanni. So he goes into Don Giovanni. He goes into different recordings of Don Giovanni. And he goes into other operas as well. And he talks about Bruce Springsteen albums, other classical works, Thelonious Monk. And so as I'm reading this book, I'm pulling up these albums and I'm listening to them. And it added another dimension to the book. Not only was it cool to learn about these works of music, but also to listen to them while I was reading. It just really enhanced the whole thing. And it introduced me to new music as well. I'd heard of Thelonious Monk. I'd probably heard his music, but I'd never consciously said, hey, I'm going to get this album and listen to it. And so I've done that with a few of Thelonious Monk's albums since reading this book, and it just kind of brings back memories from the book. So I would put it on while I was reading it, and yeah, it was so cool. So I thought of this book as a puzzle, and it had that feel to where you when you're reading it, you had to remember what you were reading. So it was almost like you had to grasp this piece of the puzzle from this part of the book and just keep it on the table there while you're reading the rest. And I took a ton of notes in the back of the book. I write quite small, and the back 2 pages of this book are completely filled. And so I was, and I read it so quickly that I was remembering a lot of what had happened and things that were said. But even stuff I would forget, and I would flip back. Like, there was not wasted words, especially at the beginning of the book. Everything tied together, and things that may have seemed like an offhand comment, they came back and they played a part in what was happening. So it was really cool, like in that sense of these different pieces of the book kind of coming together to create a puzzle. So as for who should read this book, if you're an artist, you will really enjoy this book because the protagonist is an artist, and so He's also going through a rough spot in his life. He's come from a point to where he was just doing commercially viable paintings. He was doing portraits. And that was not what he wanted to be doing, but it paid the bills. And he wanted to experiment more with art. And so part of this book is his process of gaining that back, of doing portraits, but doing them in a different way than he had been doing, and kind of getting back into that artistic process. In that sense, it was as good as a lot of the nonfiction books I've read about creativity and in art, because you're actually following this guy's life and kind of seeing as he's moving along. So if you're an artist, it's cool to see this whole artistic process and also hear about other artists throughout the book. Also, if you're into surreal books, this was cool. I mean, there's a delicate line between dream and reality in this book, and it makes me think of the Shakespeare line, "There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy." And I think it's fun to challenge your mind with books like this in the sense of, could that be real? Could that happen? I mean, there's so many things in this book where it's like, it's just past the line of like, okay, that's probably not real, or it couldn't happen, but could it? It kind of makes you think. And there's some things that are like totally wacko in this book as well. So it goes way past that line, but I love that tension of being right on the line of like, could that happen or not? And Murakami has talked about this in the surrealism in his books. And he made a comment that people in times of turmoil and political chaos really enjoy his books. And here's the start of his quote. "I was so popular in the 1990s in Russia. At the time they were changing from the Soviet Union. There was a big confusion, and people in confusion like my books. And in Germany, when the Berlin Wall fell, there was confusion, and people liked my books." So I liked this one. Maybe I'm confused, but it reminded me a lot of 100 Years of Solitude, where there's just like this dreamlike aspect to the book. So if you're into that, you will really enjoy this book. And from what I've heard of other Murakami fiction, a lot of his books, if not all of them, have that surrealism aspect to it. I also want to say who should not read this book. And if you're 18 or under, you should just not read it. And I'll put it this way. Hong Kong's Obscene Articles Tribunal classified this book as indecent material. And it's designated Class 2, which means if you are a bookseller or a retailer and you have this book out and it is not wrapped with a warning when it's displayed on the shelf, you run the risk of getting 12 months in prison and a $51,000 fine just for having the book, like showing the cover of this book. And there's nothing lewd on the cover or anything, but you have to have the book wrapped and then a proper warning on it. So it's almost like cigarettes. And there are, I call it like sexy time in the book. Like there are just a lot of crude scenes of that. And so that's a warning before this book. You may not enjoy it I did not like a lot of those scenes. It was crude and it was unnecessary in the book as well. And the Hong Kong government said it was indecent material. So warning to those that you may not like it for that reason. Here's a quick reading tip before we get into segment 2 here. If you are wanting to get through more books, the best way I found to do that is to set a goal for how many books you want to read, and then determine a specific time frame. So for me, I want to read 52 books, and I want to read that in 52 weeks or 1 year. So that means a book a week, roughly. But it doesn't mean that, because some of my books are a lot longer than others. So this one, Murakami's book, was 681 pages. Some of the other books are 200 pages. So the best thing to do is, once you've found your list and you've determined the books that you want to read, go onto Amazon or something, and you can look up how many pages each book has. Put that all down and add all those pages together, and then divide it by the number of days that are in the time period that you want to read. So for me, I have 17,000 something or 18,000 something pages that are in the 52 books that I want to read. When I divide that by 365, that means I need to read 47 pages per day. And that's really my guide. I can usually do that within 1 or 2 hours a day. So I know if I have not read one day, that I need to make up for that on another day. So a day where I have time to read 100 pages, that's going to make up for the day that kids are sick or work is crazy and I don't get any reading time. But most of the time I get in some reading, and so it's just kind of a balance and trying to maintain that 47 pages. So instead of thinking about it in terms of how many books you want to get through, start out with that as your goal, but then on the day-to-day, daily habit type part of it, put it down into what that means in pages per day, and that'll be a big help for you. So now going into segment 2, the first big idea that stuck out to me was this balance or conflict or dance between dreams and reality. When I dream about someone at night, I often wonder if they had that same dream from the opposite point of view. So if I've met up with a friend that I haven't seen in 10 years or something in my dream, did that friend have the same dream? And I don't think that does happen, but it's something I wonder about. And Murakami talks about that in this book. And there's actually parts where the protagonist wonders if he impacted somebody through his dreams, and were they able, even though they were miles apart, were they able to reach each other in some way? And it just got me thinking about that further. And I think it would be kind of a known thing by now if through tests and studies, if you had a dream, or you could just ask your friend if they had the same dream that night that you had. And I don't think that's the case, but it is kind of something fun to think about, and he goes into that quite extensively in this book. And we also, like, every morning that the protagonist wakes up, we get this description of how he slept and if he dreamed or not. So some nights it was completely dreamless. Other nights he dreamed, but he totally forgot it upon waking up. And then other times he had very vivid dreams, and we hear about those dreams. So dreams are a big part of this book, but it's mixed with reality. And then there's also this idea of the Killing Commendatore painting that becomes real. People in the painting become actual physical people in the book. So it's an idea from the painting taking physical form. It's almost, it made me think of the word becoming flesh in a way, the idea taking physical form. And here are a couple other quotes along this line, these lines of dream versus reality. There are plenty of things in history that are best left in the shadows. Accurate knowledge does not improve people's lives. The objective does not necessarily surpass the subjective, Reality does not necessarily extinguish fantasy. I thought that was cool. Reality does not necessarily extinguish fantasy. And the other one, it comes later in the book. And here it goes. There are channels through which reality can become unreal, or unreality can enter the realm of the real. And he talks about Van Gogh's painting of the Mailman. And if you're not familiar with that, just do a quick Google search and look at it. You'll probably recognize it. It's a famous painting. But Murakami talks about that of, is this person real? Well, they're not. I mean, it's a painting, so you're looking at a painting, but that person was real. So that the unreality of the painting is entering the realm of real person, and that person is an idea in your mind. Like when I read about the Van Gogh's Mailman, that image of that painting came up in my head because I've seen it before. So there's this balance throughout the book of where do ideas come from? What channels are they coming from? Are they real? Are they unreal? Are they becoming real from the unreal? And so that whole balance, it's fun. It's uncomfortable at times, but it's a neat dance, and I love when authors do that in books. I also want to just describe some other books that this one reminded me of, and some of them have been from the Books to Titans project where I've read these books, but other of them I read before the project. So the first one was one I read a long time ago, but it's The Picture of Dorian Gray, and in that book there is the protagonist in that book. He has a portrait done of himself, a painting, and then he puts that painting in a closet or an attic of some sort, and then he just goes out and lives this total debauched life. But he physically does not change. So he'll be up all night, and in the morning he looks fresh, he looks great. He does terrible things to his body, but nothing is happening to his physical appearance. But it is happening to the painting that's in the attic. So when you go in and look at that painting, he's decomposing. His fit, the wear and tear is showing on that painting, and it becomes so bad that he takes a sword and stabs the painting. Like he wants to kill that. He doesn't want that part to be known. And there's similar things in this book. The Killing Commendatore painting, when we first encounter it, it's hidden in an attic because it actually points to a period of the artist's life where he was part of an assassination plot in Austria against the Nazis, and he made it out alive, but everyone else that was a part of that assassination plan was killed and brutally killed. And so that painting is a picture, but it's something that he wants to hide. He didn't want the world to know about that. And then the protagonist in the book, he paints a picture of what he calls the guy with the white Subaru Forester. And this guy knows something that the protagonist did. And so it's almost like his conscience or somebody knowing what you've done. And so he paints a portrait of this guy, and then he also hides that painting and puts it into the attic. And there's this idea of putting things away that you don't want. And it reminded me of the picture of Dorian Gray. Second book this reminded me of, and I'm sorry for even mentioning this, but The Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown. The Da Vinci Code, there's a code within Da Vinci's paintings. That's the premise. That Da Vinci was trying to tell us things through his paintings. It's a novel. It's a work of fiction, but there's a lot of similarities in this sense to where the Killing Commendatore painting, although it's not a real painting in history, it's giving codes. It's giving information into this person's life, and I'll get into that a little bit more in the next segment. But it made me think of the Da Vinci Code, which is another book that I read a long time ago, well before this project. Another book is 100 Years of Solitude, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and again, that's another book of surrealism and that dividing line between dreams and reality. So if you like 100 Years of Solitude, which I did, you will also like Murakami's books. And the other one it reminded me of is one that I recently read and covered in a recent episode of the podcast, and that is Splendor of God. And I talked about this in the episode, but this idea of being face-to-face with somebody. And in Killing Commendatore, the protagonist is a portrait artist, and somebody hires him to do a painting, to do a portrait, and he can't do it at first because he doesn't know the person. He can do other parts of the painting, but he can't draw the face because he doesn't know the person yet. And so I like thinking about that. I like thinking of this idea that of being face to face with somebody, of seeing the nuance of expression. And it's an idea that it comes up quite a bit in a lot of the Books of Titans books. So it's something that also came up again in this one. As for criticisms for the book, I have one, and that's that the first 75% of the book was, I'll put it this way, I was unbelievably impressed with how everything fit together. Like, there were no extra words in this sense. I mean, it was very tidy. As I mentioned earlier, offhand comments, they would come back to play a role in the story. So that's the first 500 or so pages. The rest, so the last quarter, it almost seemed to me like the book was rushed out to get it published. Things became untidy, and it didn't have that tidiness of the first 3/4 of the book. So, for example, one of the characters is reading a particular paperback novel in different parts of the book. And so every time she goes to this one house, she's reading parts of this book. And she won't ever tell the name of the book, because she says whenever she tells somebody the name of the book she's reading, she doesn't read it from that point on. So she wants to get through this book. She really likes it. We're continually reminded of this book, and she's getting towards the end of the book, and I keep waiting for it. I'm like, okay, when are we going to find out what the book was that she was reading? And we never find out. And it seemed odd, because there weren't other loose ends like this in the other part of the book. I mean, it's very tidy, and then you have this kind of build up to, what's the book that she's reading? And then nothing, not even referenced again that she finished the book or anything. So that seemed really odd to me. And then the end of the book, where the protagonist goes through this ordeal, kind of goes into the underworld, it was almost too much, where that dividing line between dream and reality was pretty close. It would go a little bit far away, but then kind of come back to where, yeah, that could potentially happen. This was like La La Land. This was something else, where he goes into the underworld, and it was almost like a forced hero journey is what it felt like. We have to take the protagonist through the hero's journey. He's got to confront his deepest fear. He's got to cross the river. He's got to do these things that are the hero's journey. So we got to force this in at the end here. And yeah, I guess is the best way I can describe it. It seemed forced, and it was weird. Just like the last 25% of the book, it didn't have the same feel as the first 75%. And so I'm not sure if other people felt that way as well, but that's my one main criticism for the book. Now on to segment 3, and my one key takeaway from this book. And it's this. Murakami presents this idea of artists making confessions through their work. And it just got me thinking. It kind of made me wonder if other artists had done that, and maybe to even look into artists' lives more and see if you could find some threads, or I guess just ask the question, why was this painting painted this way, or why was this person in the painting? Why are they making this expression? Just kind of made me think. So I want to read a few quotes from the book along these lines, and then also talk about Murakami himself. So the first one deals with the artist who painted Killing Commendatore in this book. Generally speaking, I said, that might be so, but the painting is calling out to anyone who sees it. I get the sense that Tomiko Amada, who was the artist, painted it to privately capture an event that was essential to him, but he could not share with others. He changed the characters and setting to another age and made a metaphorical confession using his newly acquired skills in Japanese-style painting. End quote. So I love that phrase, made a metaphorical confession into about events that were essential to him but he could not share with others. And we find out what those events are in the book, but it was a really cool idea to me that that an artist would do a confession of things that he or she couldn't talk about, but could put them in art. And maybe it was art that they didn't expect anyone to see, or maybe art that was released after their death. But just that idea kind of sparked ideas in my head. The second one now is the protagonist in the story where we don't know his name, but here's him talking about him painting. I was painting Marie's portrait, yet I could sense elements of my dead sister Komi and my former wife Yuzu creeping into the work. That this wasn't intentional. They worked their way in quite naturally. Perhaps I was searching within Marie for reminders of those two women, so important to me, whom I had lost. I couldn't say if this was healthy or not, but what was the only way I could paint at the time? No, to say at the time is off the mark. When I thought about it, I had operated like this from the very beginning, giving form to what eluded me in reality, inscribing secret signals only I could decipher. End quote. That's cool. Giving form to what eluded me in reality, inscribing secret signals only I could decipher. So here he is painting this portrait of this young girl, and he almost can't even see the young girl because all what he's seeing is his sister who passed away when she was the same age as this girl in front of him, and then also his wife. So even though this artist is trying to paint a portrait, he's seeing other people. And then he's trying to give form to what eluded him in reality, maybe things he can't even express, maybe the pain from his sister dying young, maybe the pain from his divorce. Those things are creeping in to the art. So again, just this idea of the artist sharing things about their own life through their works of art. And that may seem like a really obvious thing, but for some reason it struck me from this book. The final thing I want to share along these lines is related to Murakami, the author himself. And in preparing for this episode, I was looking up information about Murakami, and I came across a photo of his desk. And in Killing Commendatore, there's a character and there's a description of his desk, and it's neat, and all the pencils are trimmed to the same height, and they're all sharpened, and he's got a state-of-the-art Apple desktop on the desk. And you look at this photo of Murakami's desk, and it exactly that. It's these pencils that are sharpened. They're roughly the same size. There's the new Apple desktop on the computer. So he's like describing his desk, but in this character, and it's not the protagonist; it's someone else in the story. And so there's that, but then there's also Murakami's deep love of music, and so in that same photo where you see Murakami's desk, you also see behind that a record player, and then on the right side of that room is a wall of shelves, and there are not any books on those shelves. It is all records. And so in this book, there's a deep love of records that come out in music, and the experience of putting a record player on, and especially listening to an opera on a record player, or he describes listening to Bruce Springsteen as well. And there's one album where there's a specific point where you've got to get up and flip that record over, and it's the perfect spot to flip it over because it goes from this song to that song. And then also with the opera, it would oftentimes be two different records, so 4 sides total. So you're listening to the opera, and you've got to get up at one point from the sofa or wherever you're listening, flip it over, put it back on, put the needle back on the record. And just this description of I guess more engaging with music, whereas I just get on Apple Music and search for it, and bam, I can choose from 10 different recordings of the opera, that compared to really savoring that experience with the record. That was cool. So maybe not as sinister of the in the sense of the way art makes its way through the artist making its way through the art, but with Murakami, it's more things he's interested in and perhaps taking from his own desk and that sort of thing. And then, as I stated, parts of his life. If you've read the book, you'll notice a lot of those things show up with trauma from World War II, a Buddhist priest, different pieces that come through. So neat thing to think about, and something I'm still thinking about after having read this book. So to recap, I really enjoyed this book. It's vying for the top position of the books I've read so far for 2019. It's tied up there with All the King's Men, and it struck a chord with me with the musical references and it really being like putting a puzzle together. But it was also a very interesting story. Murakami has this ability that most of the book takes place within maybe like a mile of three different houses within that mile, and a lot of it takes place there. But you are embedded in this world. You feel like you're there, and you can picture it, and then the surreal aspects of it, the dreamlike aspects. It's just you are within this world, and it's a cool experience. I really enjoyed this work, and I hope to read more of Murakami's books in years ahead. That's going to do it for this episode. Before I sign off, a reminder that you can now share your reading list on the Books of Titans website by going to booksoftitans.com/mybooks. You can also follow Books of Titans on Instagram or Twitter at Books of Titans. And if you haven't already done so, you can subscribe to this podcast and find all of our past episodes through iTunes, the Android Marketplace, or your podcast manager of choice. If you're enjoying the podcast, please make sure to give it an effusive 5-star rating on iTunes and share your favorite episodes on social media. I'll be back next week covering Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie. Until then, keep reading, keep learning, and keep listening. I'm out.